The ballroom at the Hargrove estate looked exactly the way my son had described it to me 6 months ago when he first showed me the venue brochure. High ceilings with copper chandeliers, a terrace that opened onto the garden, enough room for 200 people to sit comfortably and still feel like they had space to breathe. I remember thinking, standing in the doorway that evening, that it was a beautiful place for a young couple to begin their life together. I also remember thinking that I had paid for all of it, not just the venue. The flowers that came up from a grower in Virginia. The band, a 7-piece jazz ensemble my daughter-in-law had fallen in love with after hearing them at a charity event in Savannah. The open bar, which I had quietly upgraded 3 weeks before the wedding when she mentioned, almost in passing, that the original package felt a little thin. The late-night food station. The monogram napkins. The custom centerpieces that took a woman in Asheville 4 months to hand-make. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a civil engineering firm from 2 employees and a rented office in Charlotte to something that could support not just my family, but the families of 47 other people. I don't say that to brag. I say it because it matters to the story. Because the people sitting in that ballroom, laughing at the joke my daughter-in-law's mother had just made about me, had no idea what kind of man was standing quietly near the back wall. My son came to me 11 months before the wedding and told me he and Cassandra wanted to get married in the fall. He was nervous about the conversation, which told me he already knew what he was about to ask. I told him to just say it straight, the kind of wedding Cassandra wants. Her family can't cover it, Dan, and we can't either, not yet. I asked him how much. He slid a piece of paper across the kitchen table. $112,000. I looked at the number for a long moment. Then I looked at my son, who was 31 years old and had my mother's eyes, and I told him, yes, his name is Colin. I want you to know that before I go any further, because everything that happened that night happened because of who Colin is, not who I am. The planning started almost immediately. Cassandra was organized, I'll give her that. She had a binder, color-coded tabs, a shared spreadsheet she sent me access to so I could stay in the loop. Her mother, a woman named Roberta, handled most of the communication on their side and from the beginning. Her manner with me was polite, in the specific way that people are polite to someone they consider useful but not important. She called me Mr. Ashby for 8 months. Never once asked me to call her by her first name. I didn't push it. That's not my nature. What I did do consistently and without complaint was sign the checks, the venue deposit, the caterer's retainer, the florist, the photographer, who charged more per hour than I billed during my first year in business. When the band's contract came through with a clause about a travel fee I hadn't expected, I paid it without mentioning it to anyone. When Cassandra decided, 6 weeks before the wedding, that she wanted to add a dessert bar, I added it. Colin called me after that one. He said, "Dad, you don't have to keep saying yes to everything." I told him that was what fathers were for. Roberta never called to thank me for any of it. Not once. Which is fine. I wasn't doing it for thank yous. I was doing it because Colin loved Cassandra, and I wanted their wedding to be everything they'd imagined. What I was not prepared for was the toast. I should back up. About 30 minutes into the reception, after the first dances and the salad course, Cassandra's uncle, a loud man named Prescott who had driven down from Ohio with a new wife nobody had met before, stood up without being asked and decided to give a toast. He was already on his 3rd drink. I could tell from across the room. He started with the usual things. How beautiful Cassandra looked. What a lucky man Colin was. Then he started talking about the wedding itself. How spectacular everything was, how generous Cassandra's family had been to put all this together. I didn't correct him. I sat at my table, which was not at the front of the room, and I drank my water, and I let it go. But then Prescott said something else. He looked out over the room with the particular confidence of a man who thinks he's about to say something funny, and he said, "And I hear Colin's dad chipped in too." He paused for effect. Nice of the stepfather to contribute. The room laughed. Cassandra laughed. And then I looked at my son. Colin was sitting at the head table, and he had gone very still. He was not laughing. His jaw had tightened in the way it used to when he was 12 years old and trying not to cry. He looked at me across the room, and I could see it on his face. Apology, shame, something close to grief. I gave him a small nod. "I'm okay," the nod said. "I'm fine." But I wasn't entirely. Because what Prescott had said wasn't just wrong about the facts. It was a summary of how I had been seen by Cassandra's family for the entire 11 months of planning. The man who wrote the checks. The stepfather. A title delivered with just enough amusement to make clear that I was there to serve a function, not to be respected. I'm not Colin's stepfather. I'm his father. His mother and I divorced when he was 22 years old. We had been married for 26 years. He chose to keep my name. He calls me every Sunday. He asked me to be in the room when he proposed to Cassandra. None of that had apparently made its way into whatever narrative Cassandra's family had constructed about me. I sat there for a moment and considered my options. The easiest thing would have been to do nothing. Finish the meal. Smile when people looked over. Drive back to my hotel and tell myself it didn't matter. But then I looked at Colin again, and I saw that he was standing up. He picked up his glass. He didn't tap it. Didn't wait for a microphone. He just stood up and the room went quiet, because there's something about a groom standing up at his own reception that makes people pay attention. "I want to say something," Colin said. His voice was completely steady. "I know Prescott already gave a toast, and I'm not trying to top it. A few polite laughs. But I don't think the people in this room have the full picture, and I'd like to make sure they do." He looked at me. "My father is sitting at that table in the back. His name is Robert Ashby. He built a company from nothing, over 30 years, and he has been one of the most generous and quietly decent people I have ever known. He paid for this wedding. Not part of it, most of it." Colin paused. "He paid for the venue you're sitting in, the food you ate, the band you've been dancing to, the flowers on your table. He did it because I asked him to, and he said yes without hesitating, and he never once asked for anything in return." The room was completely silent. "He's not my stepfather," Colin said. "He's my dad, and I want him to know that I see him, even when other people don't." He raised his glass toward me. "I don't embarrass easily. I have sat across the table from city councils and federal inspectors and contractors who wanted to renegotiate terms the morning of a pour. I do not rattle. But sitting there in the back of that ballroom while my son looked at me and raised his glass, I had to press my lips together and look at the ceiling for a moment. The room applauded. Some people more enthusiastically than others. Prescott sat down very quickly and did not look in my direction for the rest of the evening. Roberta, I noticed, was looking at her plate. About 40 minutes later, I got up to get some air on the terrace. It was a clear October night, just cool enough for a jacket. I stood there with a glass of sparkling water and watched the lights of the garden, and after a few minutes I heard the door open behind me. It was Cassandra. She stood beside me without saying anything at first. She was still in her dress, holding the skirt up slightly off the flagstone. After a moment she said, "I didn't know Prescott was going to say that." "I know," I said. "I also didn't correct him when he did." "I didn't say anything. I laughed," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't think I've been fair to you. I think I let my mother's opinion of the situation color how I treated you. And that wasn't right. You were generous to us in a way that I think I just accepted without really thinking about what it meant." I turned and looked at her. She was 29 years old, and she had clearly been crying, and she was looking at me with the expression of someone who had just understood something important and was not sure it was too late. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her. "Is it, yeah? Is it enough?" she asked. "After everything?" I thought about that honestly. "Tonight it is," I said. "Ask me again in a year." She nodded. She looked back at the garden. After a moment she said, "He talks about you constantly, you know. Colin, he talks about you more than he talks about almost anyone." "He's a good son," I said. "He's a good man," she said. "I think he learned that from you." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. We went back inside separately. The band had moved into a slower set. I watched Colin dance with his grandmother, a tiny woman in her 80s who had insisted on flying in from Phoenix and was currently leading him around the floor with remarkable authority. I laughed at something I couldn't hear from across the room, and for a little while, I forgot about Prescott and Roberta and everything else, but I'm 63 years old, and I have been paying close attention to people for a long time. And what I understood, walking out of that ballroom at the end of the night, was something I should have paid more attention to during the 11 months before it. There is a particular kind of person who can take your generosity, organize it into something beautiful, and then introduce you to their family as a footnote. They are not usually malicious. They are simply people for whom the question of who provided something never carries as much weight as the question of who received it. I have been that kind of person's footnote before. I was not going to be it again. In January, 3 months after the wedding, my ex-wife called to tell me that Roberta had reached out to her. Reached out, can you imagine? To ask whether I might be open to helping with the down payment on a house Colin and Cassandra were looking at in Raleigh. A lovely craftsman bungalow, apparently. 4 bedrooms, good school district. I listened to my ex-wife read me the message. Then I said, tell her I'll reach out directly. I did call. I called Roberta on a Tuesday morning, and I was pleasant and I was clear. I told her that I loved my son and I would always be there for Colin in the ways that a father is there for his child. I told her that going forward, those conversations would happen between me and Colin directly, not through her and not through his mother. She started to say something about how the family just wanted to be helpful in facilitating. I said, Roberta, I think we both know what kind of facilitating has been happening. I don't think we need to pretend otherwise. She went quiet. I wish you well, I said. I mean that, but I'm going to need you to let Colin and me handle our relationship ourselves. I hung up. Colin called me 2 days later. He had clearly heard about the conversation, and he was quiet at first, which is what he does when he's working something out. Finally he said, she means well, Dad. She just doesn't always. I know, I said. I'm not angry at her. I just needed to be clear. Another pause, then what she said. And Prescott, at the reception. I've been thinking about it a lot. Don't, I said. Dad? Colin. I waited until I had his attention. What you did at that reception, standing up like that was one of the finest things I've ever seen anyone do. I want you to know that. I don't need anything else from that night. He was quiet for a moment. You deserve more from us, from the whole planning process. I should have pushed back more. You're pushing back now, I said. That counts. We talked for another hour. About the house in Raleigh, which they were still considering. About a project I was working on, a pedestrian bridge over a creek in Greensboro that I was particularly proud of. About his grandmother, who had apparently not stopped talking about the wedding since she got back to Phoenix, and had already told 3 of her friends that the band was the finest she'd heard since 1987. Before we hung up, he said, I love you, Dad. I love you, Ty, I said. I love you, Ty, I said. Every Sunday, he agreed. I'm not telling the story because I need sympathy. I am 63 years old and I have a company I'm proud of, and a son I'm proud of, and a life that has, on balance, given me far more than it has taken. I can afford to pay for a wedding. I can afford a lot of things. What I cannot afford, and what I have learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, is to let people confuse my willingness to give with an absence of self-respect. Those are not the same thing. I gave because I wanted to, because Colin asked me and I love him and it was the right thing to do. But my generosity was never an invitation to be invisible. It was never a signal that I didn't matter. And the moment that someone, especially someone at a room full of people, with a microphone and a fresh drink, treated it that way, I needed to know that someone would say something. I did not expect that someone to be my son. That he stood up without being asked, in front of 200 people and said what he said, is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. A few months ago, I drove up to Raleigh to see the house they ended up buying, not the Craftsman bungalow. A different place, a 1940s colonial with wide front steps and a porch that faces west. Cassandra had planted something in the front bed that was just starting to come in. Colin made coffee. We sat on that west-facing porch in the late afternoon and watched the light change. At one point, Cassandra said, "We want to do Thanksgiving here this year, if you'd come." I said I'd come. On the drive home, somewhere on I-85 just south of Burlington, I thought about the ballroom, about the chandeliers and the jazz band and the monogrammed napkins, about Prescott and his toast and the laughter that followed, about my son standing up. And I thought, well, you don't always get to choose how a story starts, but sometimes, if you're patient and if you're raised a good man, you get to choose how it continues. I turned the radio on. I drove home. I've thought a lot about that night since it happened. Not obsessively, I'm too old for that, but in the way you think about something that quietly rearranged your understanding of yourself. What Prescott said in that ballroom wasn't just a bad joke. It was the result of something that had been building for nearly a year. When you give consistently and generously, and nobody in the room stops to ask how any of it happened, you start to become part of the furniture. Expected. Invisible. The thing that makes everything possible but gets introduced, when it gets introduced at all, as a footnote. I let that happen. I want to be honest about that. Every time I signed a check without asking for acknowledgement, I was teaching people how to receive from me, and what I taught them, without meaning to, was that my giving had no weight behind it, that I was simply a resource, not a person. That's not wisdom. That's just a slow kind of self-erasure that feels like generosity while it's happening. What I understand now, and what I think Colin understood long before I did, is that real generosity and real self-respect are not opposites. You can give everything you have and still require that people see you clearly. Those two things do not cancel each other out. In fact, the moment you start treating them as if they do, you've already started disappearing. Cassandra's family never asked about me because nobody required them to. I was present at every meeting, available for every question, accommodating at every turn, and I never once said, "I am a person here, not just a function." That silence was my doing. And it cost me something I didn't fully notice until a man named Prescott said "stepfather" into a microphone with a smirk on his face, and a room full of people laughed. But here is what I also know. Colin saw it. He had probably been seeing it for months, and when the moment came, not planned, not rehearsed, just a Tuesday evening decision made in front of 200 people, he stood up and told the truth. That takes something. It takes the kind of character that isn't built in a single moment but assembled, slowly, out of everything a person has watched and absorbed and chosen to carry forward. I'd like to think I contributed something to that. Not the money, the other things. The Sunday phone calls. The way I tried to handle difficulty without making it everyone else's problem. The times I chose honesty over comfort in conversations that would have been easier to let slide. Those things matter. They accumulate. And sometimes at a reception in October with jazz playing in the background, they stand up in the body of a 31-year-old man and say what needs to be said. What I tell anyone listening to this story is simple. Generosity is not the same as self-erasure. Kindness is not the same as invisibility. You are allowed to give freely and still expect to be seen as a human being in return. And if the people around you cannot hold both of those things at once, that tells you something important. Not about your worth, but about theirs. I drove home from Raleigh a few months ago with the windows down and the radio on. I thought about the porch and the coffee and Cassandra's plants coming in along the front walk. I thought about Colin saying every Sunday before he hung up, "Some things take a long time to become what they were always going to be." I think that's all right. The point is that they get there